Imagine the roar of aircraft overhead, darkened skies, nothing but grey metal slicing through cold air. Then, a thunderclap. Shells explode, tanks crush earth, men run, confusion, smoke, screams, chaos, every second counts. One misstep, death. One misslide, collapse. People fall, dreams shatter, nations tremble. The air is thick with dust, fear, urgency. Nothing will ever be the same. Now pause. Picture yourself in that moment. You hear orders shouted, the ground trembling beneath armored treads, bursts of machine gun fire rattling bones. You glimpse a horizon lost, cities swallowed by movement, nations thrown off balance. How did it come to this? How did a proud nation fall so fast with such fury unleashed? What dark strategy? What ruthless precision? What terrifying speed? Welcome, history warriors, I'm Knightley. You're about to witness history like never before. In the spring of 1940, Europe stood poised on a razor's edge, far beyond a border dispute, a titanic struggle for survival. On one side, the proud armies of France, their line of fortifications known as the Maginot Line, vast infantry, heavy artillery, years of preparation. France believed in defense, in solidity, in time. On the other side, a rising juggernaut, Germany under a regime unlike any other, armed with new ideas in warfare, blood-chilling efficiency, and a doctrine built on shock, speed, and ruthlessness. The stage, Northern Europe. The players, nations ancient and new, bound by treaties and fears. Great Britain watched across the Channel, its navy ready, its resolve tested. Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, small lands caught between giants. What hung in the balance was more than territory. It was hearts, it was power, it was the future of Europe. Could France hold the line? Could the Allies stop the momentum of change? Or would the world witness a new kind of war, lightning, as real as thunder, fast enough to erase borders in days? In quiet meeting rooms, commanders traced lines on maps. In barracks, soldiers readied weapons, washed fatigues, clenched fists. In capitals, leaders wondered if the gamble would pay. Yet beneath that calm, beneath those foldable maps and polished boots, tension. A silent warning. The air charged with dread. In a few days, that calm would shatter. The dawn of May 1940 saw Europe tense, the quiet before a storm that would leave no battlefield unchanged. Maps were spread across tables, pencils scratching predictions, coffee cooling in cups untouched. France believed its fortifications along the Maginot Line were invincible. Officers spoke in calm tones, discussing battalions, artillery, and logistics, confident that their defense could withstand any frontal assault. But Germany's generals thought differently. Heinz Guderian, eyes sharp behind round spectacles, envisioned warfare not as a grind, but as a fast, decisive strike. Tanks, motorized infantry, and close air support, a new symphony of destruction, a choreography designed to paralyze, confuse, and crush the enemy before it could react. For the Germans, speed was doctrine, surprise, obsession, success, a matter of timing and audacity. Across the French countryside, rail lines hummed with reinforcements, roads with armored convoys, and soldiers marched, boots in rhythm, unaware of how quickly their world was about to shift. Each side believed in its plan. Each commander prepared meticulously. The tension coiled tighter. Every soldier, every tank, every map mark, a piece of a puzzle that would explode in days. In Berlin, the Luftwaffe readied its engines, wings gleaming under pale morning light. Dive bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance planes hummed with purpose. Hermann Göring paced, eyes sharp, envisioning a sky swarming with iron, a network of fire above advancing armor. Intelligence reports whispered of French complacency, of roads clogged with unsuspecting troops. Every hour counted. Every reconnaissance flight brought new insight. Every calculation honed the edge of war. Meanwhile, French generals clung to tradition. Infantry drills, regimented artillery placements, and meticulous fortification maintenance dominated their days. General Maurice Gamelin, a man cautious to the point of rigidity, believed that superior numbers and well-positioned defenses would blunt any attack. His optimism, though sincere, was vulnerable to methods unseen in textbooks. Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands, small nations with limited armies, braced for impact. Governments debated neutrality, but borders could not contain the oncoming storm. Civilians packed, soldiers waited, and diplomats whispered behind closed doors. The tension of preparation hung over the continent like an electric charge before lightning strikes. Every general knew the first move could define the war, yet none could fully predict the scale of what was coming. The pieces were in place. The personalities behind the strategies were as decisive as the weapons themselves. On the German side, General Erwin Rommel, young, audacious, a master of mobility, pushed for bold flanking maneuvers. His eyes scanned maps as if they were puzzles, every village, forest and river a potential opportunity. Guderian's armored units, mechanized and fast, were like a living machine, fuel, steel, and iron nerves. They thrived on initiative, on seizing gaps before the enemy could respond. Across the border, French leadership embodied caution. General Alphonse Georges advocated methodical defense, relying on fortifications and predictable formations. Officers drilled coordination between infantry and artillery, believing rigid organization was the backbone of victory. Yet this rigidity left blind spots, avenues the Germans would exploit with devastating speed. Meanwhile, British liaison officers observed quietly, sending cryptic cables back across the Channel. Churchill's voice, distant yet insistent, emphasized preparedness, mobility, and intelligence. London knew France was strong, but not invulnerable. The Royal Air Force readied squadrons to support, should the line be broken, while the Navy prepped for rapid evacuation if disaster struck. Maps, orders, and whispers, each layer built tension, like a tightening spring ready to snap. Every move was a gamble. Tanks rolled quietly through morning mist, their engines' low rumbles echoing across French roads. Germany's panzer divisions were more than metal. They were instruments of precision, each platoon trained to exploit gaps, bypass obstacles, and strike decisively. Communications were sleek, radios in every vehicle, officers issuing orders with near-instant speed. Speed itself became a weapon. French forces, meanwhile, moved in disciplined columns. Artillery pieces were positioned meticulously, infantry marched in precise formations, cavalry units patrolled lightly. The Maginot Line stood like stone guardians along the border, confident in their immovability. Yet the French approach, though methodical, lacked the flexibility to respond to lightning strikes. Behind the lines, logistics were vital. Fuel depots, ammunition stockpiles, and medical units stretched for miles. Every supply train, every truck, every hidden cache could determine victory or collapse. The Germans focused on rapid resupply, on striking hard while maintaining momentum. The Allies relied on slower, deliberate replenishment, and above all, the skies awaited. Aircraft readiness, weather reports, reconnaissance flights, every detail could tilt the first hours of battle. The air hung tense, charged with anticipation. As May deepened, commanders felt the pressure tighten like a vice. Orders multiplied, maps layered atop maps, every possible contingency debated. Guderian refined his route through the Ardennes, insisting speed and surprise would shatter the enemy's expectations. Rommel practiced coordination between tanks and motorized infantry, envisioning a rapid collapse of defensive lines. Every unit, every battalion, every man counted in the calculation of war. French generals, confident in their Maginot Line and defensive doctrine, held staff meetings late into the night. They discussed troop placements, artillery concentrations, and potential German avenues of attack, yet overlooked the Ardennes, dismissing it as impassable. Their assumptions became a blindfold, leaving gaps that would soon be exploited. Meanwhile, civilians sensed unease. Trains creaked under the weight of mobilization. Farmers watched columns of soldiers march past fields, sensing the coming storm, but unable to know its scale. Intelligence reports circulated like whispers, small, inconsistent, but unsettling. Every move seemed rehearsed, every moment a prelude to chaos. Tension was palpable. Every heartbeat, every shuffle of boots, every pen scratching orders on paper carried the weight of the impending clash. Weapons gleamed in hangars and depots, ready to translate strategy into reality. Panzer tanks, sleek and fast, were loaded with armor-piercing shells, infantry rifles polished to a metallic sheen, machine guns mounted on half-tracks, Flamethrowers and mortars checked for readiness. German engineering ensured every vehicle and soldier could act as a single devastating unit. French forces, relying on heavy artillery and entrenched positions, prepared for attrition. Cannons pointed toward expected approaches. Trenches dug meticulously, barbed wire laid in long, spiraling patterns. Yet the static defense, while formidable, could not match the velocity of modern mechanized warfare. Air power became a silent predator. Reconnaissance planes mapped enemy positions, bomber squadrons planned runs to disrupt supply lines, fighters trained to dominate the skies. Weather reports were studied obsessively. Cloud cover could hide attacks, wind could alter flight paths, rain could slow movement. Every factor mattered. Commanders paced endlessly, radios hummed, telegraphs clicked. Plans were rehearsed, contingencies rehearsed, nerves tested. The stage was set, the players ready. The first movements were quiet, almost imperceptible. German columns glided along forested paths in the Ardennes, motor engines low, treads gripping the damp earth. Each division advanced with a rhythm, rehearsed and precise, waiting for the moment to strike. Supply trucks followed closely, ensuring fuel and ammunition would keep the momentum alive. French reconnaissance reported few disturbances. Patrols noted minor vehicle movements in distant forests, dismissed as exercises or routine maneuvers. Confidence in the Maginot Line and static defense reinforced assumptions. The Ardennes was impassable, a natural barrier against armored assaults. At headquarters, German officers refined timing and coordination. Radio messages crackled with updates, bridges secured, fords crossed, scouts reporting unexpected gaps. Rommel's voice cut sharply, directing units to exploit any opening. Guderian's panzers adjusted positions, ready to punch through the weak points. The tension was electric. Commanders' eyes flicked between maps and reports. Soldiers felt anticipation like a drumbeat in the chest. Every road, every hill, every shadow in the forest held potential for success or disaster. Final orders cascaded down the chain of command. German officers checked coordinates, synchronized watches, and confirmed radio frequencies. The assault plan was simple in theory, brutal in execution: move fast, bypass the expected, strike deep. Every panzer, every half-track, every squad had a role, a rhythm, a beat in the machine of war. French units dug, stocked, and waited. Trenches were measured, barbed wire stretched taut. Artillery shells were inspected, and troops drilled in repeated maneuvers. Confidence persisted, but under the surface, unease whispered. Reports of movement in unlikely sectors, rumors of German ingenuity. Staff officers debated reactions, contingency plans sketched in haste. In the skies, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights traced the lines of defense, noting supply concentrations, troop movements, and terrain that could facilitate rapid passage. Bombers and fighters practiced timing, angles, and formations. Speed was their ally, surprise their weapon. The entire continent seemed to hold its breath. Roads were quiet, forests still, artillery poised. The armies were aligned, the tension sharp, and the first moment would define the coming days. Coordination became the heartbeat of the German advance. Tanks moved in concert with infantry, motorized units flanking, engineers ready to clear obstacles, radio operators ensuring commands flowed instantly. Every soldier, every vehicle, every weapon was part of a living, breathing machine, poised to exploit the smallest crack in the enemy's armor. French intelligence tried to monitor these movements. Scouts reported unusual motorized activity, armored columns in unexpected forests, reconnaissance planes tracking irregular patterns. Yet assumptions about the Ardennes and the Maginot Line left them unprepared for speed and deception. Confidence in established doctrine blinded many to innovation in motion. In quiet headquarters, maps were annotated with last-minute changes. Bridges were reinforced or bypassed, alternate routes identified, reserves positioned for rapid response. Commanders debated, predicted, recalculated, but no plan could perfectly anticipate the chaos to come. Across Europe, tension was tangible. Soldiers felt it in every drum of boots, officers in every clipped order, civilians in every distant rumble. The stage was set. The moment of impact approached. The German breakthrough strategy hinged on audacity. Guderian and Rommel envisioned armored spearheads tearing through the Ardennes, bypassing fortified sectors and racing toward the Channel. Every division had a precise path, every unit a synchronized objective. The plan was not brute force, it was precision and speed, a storm measured in seconds and kilometers. French generals, meanwhile, focused on expected assaults. Heavy artillery concentrated on the Maginot Line, infantry positioned for frontal attacks, cavalry units patrolling forests they believed impassable. The disconnect between doctrine and innovation grew. Confidence in static defense masked the vulnerabilities forming in the east. Air power would dictate control. Luftwaffe reconnaissance identified bridges, gaps, and road networks suitable for rapid armor movement. Fighter wings trained to dominate skies, while bombers targeted depots and communications. Control of the air would shape every ground engagement. In towns and villages, civilians watched columns of soldiers, feeling the tension in the roads, the forests, the quiet fields. Everywhere, the continent waited for the first flash of war to ignite the carefully built stage. Final rehearsals ran like clockwork. German units conducted mock maneuvers, tanks pivoting, infantry advancing, engineers clearing simulated obstacles. Every commander checked synchronization. Every soldier reviewed signals and hand signs. The machine was ready. French intelligence intercepted fragments of radio chatter. Reports of panzer movements through unlikely terrain reached staff, yet they were dismissed, categorized as routine exercises or exaggerations. Confidence in tradition overshadowed caution. Maps were rechecked, troop dispositions reaffirmed, and artillery calibration repeated. Supply lines were tested. Fuel depots in Germany were stocked for rapid consumption. Ammunition moved closer to the front. Spare parts readied for immediate replacement. Mobility was the lifeblood of the Blitzkrieg strategy. Every truck, every fuel can, every wheel mattered. Across the Channel, Britain observed quietly. RAF reconnaissance confirmed unusual German activity, and contingency plans were drafted for intervention. Civilian morale braced, soldiers' nerves tightened, and the sense of imminent collision spread. The stage was complete. Every move anticipated, yet the first shot could still redefine everything. May 10th approached with a quiet intensity. German forces occupied forward positions, engines idling, soldiers poised, eyes scanning forests and ridges. Every step forward had been calculated, every kilometer of advance rehearsed. Rommel's units readied to punch through gaps with lightning precision, while Guderian synchronized movements across divisions. French forces remained vigilant yet rigid. Trenches along expected approaches bristled with rifles, artillery readied, reserves positioned. Commanders monitored radio chatter, skeptical but watchful, confident that fortified lines and methodical planning would prevail. The skies above whispered tension. Reconnaissance planes flew low, mapping and photographing positions, reporting movement. Bombers prepped, fighter wings awaited the order to dominate. Control of the air would determine the tempo of the battle, and both sides understood this implicitly. Maps, reports, rehearsals, and reconnaissance culminated in a silent crescendo. Every soldier knew the day was near, even if they could not grasp the scale. The quiet stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap into chaos. The first hours of May 10th shimmered with anticipation. German columns advanced from the Ardennes shadows, treads gripping damp soil, engines barely a whisper in the still morning. Scouts reported French positions, bridges secured, forests cleared. Every element moved in harmony, a prelude to the storm. French soldiers patrolled in disciplined formations, confident the Maginot Line and other fortifications would hold. Officers debated small-scale maneuvers, unaware of the sweeping flanks already taking shape. Reserves were positioned, but misjudged, leaving critical sectors exposed. Commanders checked every detail. German radios buzzed with confirmations. French lines were quiet, a deceptive calm. Engineers prepared bridges, cleared roads, and set charges for rapid use. Mobility would be decisive. Speed and coordination were weapons as lethal as any gun or shell. Civilians watched silently from towns and villages, sensing tension in the forests and fields. Horses neighed, dogs barked, the air heavy with anticipation. Across Europe, hearts raced, anticipating the first lightning strike that would shatter months of preparation. The final minutes before contact were electric. German panzer divisions shifted into position, engines low, radio chatter precise. Officers signaled with gestures, confirming alignment of armor, infantry, and reconnaissance units. Every man, every vehicle, every weapon prepared for a single synchronized movement. French sentries scanned forests and roads, rifles ready, binoculars straining. Artillery crews double-checked coordinates, yet confidence in static defense blinded them to the speed and audacity closing in. The Ardennes, deemed impassable, hid the most dangerous threat of all. A concentrated, mechanized assault ready to pierce the heart of France. In the skies, reconnaissance planes mapped final routes. Bombers and fighters waited on standby. Clouds hung low, light shifting across fields and rivers. Every detail would influence the first strike: sun angle, wind, terrain. Commanders on both sides felt the tension tighten. Every heartbeat, every whispered order, every glance across the table could mark the difference between control and catastrophe. The first engines growled. German panzers shifted forward, their tracks pressing soft earth into mud, advancing toward the unsuspecting French lines. Motorized infantry followed closely, rifles ready, eyes scanning the horizon for targets. Engineers moved ahead, clearing debris, marking routes, ensuring momentum would not falter. French officers noticed subtle signs of movement: distant rumble, unusual dust on roads, scouts returning with fragmented reports. Confidence in the Maginot Line and entrenched positions created hesitation. Decisions were cautious, deliberate, yet the clock of war ticked relentlessly. Air reconnaissance circled overhead, observing, recording, relaying information instantly. Fighter wings waited to clear the skies, bombers poised to disrupt logistics, while infantry below marched in tight formation, each man part of a lethal rhythm. The tension was tangible, thick as smoke before an explosion. Every soldier knew that the first clash would define the coming days, every commander aware that a single misstep could unravel months of planning. German flanking units edged closer to the French lines, moving with deliberate precision. Forests concealed their progress, streams and ridges ignored as obstacles. Rommel's armored spearheads adjusted for terrain, scouting parties marking bridges, fords, and choke points. Every movement was synchronized, every decision calculated to maximize surprise. French commanders received sporadic intelligence reports. Some urged caution, others believed the movements were exercises. Confidence in established doctrine masked vulnerability. Troops remained positioned for frontal assaults. Artillery concentrated on expected approaches, leaving flanks exposed. The Luftwaffe maintained a watchful eye from above, relaying positions to ground commanders. Dive bombers and fighters awaited orders to strike critical points. Air dominance would enable the Germans to disrupt communications and supply lines, giving the panzers free rein to maneuver. In towns along the route, civilians sensed unease. Horses pawed nervously, windows rattled in the wind, distant echoes of engines sending ripples of anxiety. The continent braced, as if holding its breath, awaiting the eruption that would define history. Every unit knew the stakes. German panzers aligned with infantry columns, engineers poised to clear obstacles, and artillery adjusted for rapid support. Orders were crisp, radios alive with confirmation. Each soldier understood the rhythm: move, strike, exploit, repeat. Speed would be the weapon, coordination, the shield. French troops maintained defensive positions along anticipated avenues of attack. Trenches bristled, machine guns mounted, artillery primed. Officers debated minor redeployments, unaware that decisive pressure would soon hit unprotected sectors. Reliance on traditional methods left them vulnerable to innovation in motion. Reconnaissance flights reported French dispositions. Light bombers were assigned to harass supply lines. Fighters remained ready to dominate the skies. Weather, visibility, terrain, all factors considered meticulously. Commanders fine-tuned timing to the second. Across the countryside, civilians watched the horizon, sensing tension in distant forests and roads. The stage for the Blitzkrieg was set, the instruments of war poised, and the first clash could happen at any moment. The final synchronization hummed like a tightly wound clock. German divisions aligned, tanks idling, infantry crouched, engineers at the ready. Every move was rehearsed, every signal anticipated. Radios crackled confirmation, maps marked positions, and commanders reviewed timing one last time. French officers watched quietly, adjusting small movements, confident their defenses would absorb the expected attacks. Orders were repeated, artillery positions verified, reserves placed behind lines, yet they remained unaware of the concentrated mechanized assault moving through supposedly impassable terrain. The Luftwaffe's reconnaissance planes traced the final paths, noting French concentrations and potential gaps. Dive bombers awaited, fighters circling, ready to dominate the skies and disrupt logistics. Intelligence planning and training reached their peak in the final hours. In villages along the frontier, civilians sensed a shifting tension. Horses shied in farmyards, distant engines sounded faintly, the air seemed heavier with anticipation. The continent teetered on the edge of a storm no one could fully control. The first signals were subtle. Engines hummed, dust lifted along hidden forest paths. Scouts reported movement in unexpected sectors. German units held positions just beyond sight, waiting for the precise moment to advance. Rommel's spearheads flexed like coiled springs ready to drive deep. French officers received fragments of reports. Some dismissed them as exercises, others urged caution. Confidence in the Maginot Line and static doctrine tempered urgency, leaving critical sectors exposed. Infantry remained in anticipated positions, artillery aimed at likely avenues, reserves stationed too far to react quickly. Above, Luftwaffe planes maintained vigilance. Observation flights relayed every movement, and bomber formations prepared to disrupt supply chains and communications. Air control would dictate ground momentum, and the Germans depended on it completely. The tension in the air was nearly palpable. Soldiers' nerves vibrated with anticipation. Commanders' brows furrowed over maps, and civilians watched roads and forests with unease. The stage for the Blitzkrieg was set. All that remained was the first spark. The final seconds stretched like elastic. German tanks idled in forests, engines warm, guns ready. Infantry crouched along concealed routes, radios alive with whispered confirmations. Engineers checked bridges, marked paths, and prepared for rapid movement. Every unit held its breath, waiting for the signal that would unleash the first wave. French forces remained poised, focused on traditional avenues of attack. Artillery crews double-checked calibration, riflemen patrolled anticipated lines, officers repeated orders. Yet the unexpected flanking forces in the Ardennes went largely unnoticed. Confidence in preparation masked vulnerability. Above, Luftwaffe reconnaissance and fighter wings hovered, ready to strike. Bombers prepared to disrupt logistics, while fighters patrolled to ensure air superiority. Timing was everything. One miscalculation could unravel the entire advance. Civilians sensed the tension. Horses pawed, doors rattled, distant engines hummed across fields and forests. The continent held its breath, poised on the edge of chaos, as the carefully rehearsed storm waited for its signal. Silence before the storm. Battle begins. The morning sun barely pierced the mist when the first German tanks roared out of the Ardennes. Steel tracks crushed the soft earth, engines growling like beasts awakened. Infantry followed, rifles ready, eyes scanning the horizon for flashes of the enemy. French sentries heard distant rumbles. Orders were shouted. Artillery crews swung barrels into position. Machine guns clicked as soldiers braced, hearts pounding. For months, they had drilled for this, yet nothing prepared them for the thunder approaching from the forested slopes. The first explosions shattered the quiet. Bridges trembled, trees splintered, smoke curling skyward. A line of French defenders fired into shadows, hoping to halt the oncoming tide. Tanks pivoted, artillery returned fire, and the clash of steel, earth, and fire erupted across the landscape. Commanders on both sides shouted into radios, issuing last-minute adjustments. Soldiers moved like synchronized cogs, each aware that one misstep could mean disaster. Chaos had arrived. The battle for France was no longer theoretical, it was alive, ferocious, unstoppable. The first clash had begun. Smoke and dust filled the early morning sky. German tanks punched through the forest edges, machine guns sweeping fields, infantry trailing in precise formations. Artillery thundered in reply, shaking earth and rattling nerves. French troops scrambled to adjust. Trenches offered some cover, but gaps in the line allowed panzers to maneuver with alarming speed. Officers shouted orders over chaos, trying to patch defenses as explosions tore soil and timber apart. Above, the Luftwaffe roared, dive bombers streaking past clouds, targeting supply columns and radio relays. French anti-aircraft guns fired, smoke curling from shells, but the sky belonged to the attackers. Each bomb, each strafing run, spread confusion and fear, amplifying the ground assault. Civilians peered from village edges, the distant roar of engines and artillery shaking windows, nerves frayed with each echo. Roads clogged with retreating vehicles, yet momentum carried the Germans forward. The front line fractured. What had been a quiet dawn now became a storm of steel, fire and smoke. The advance intensified. German armor surged through open fields, pivoting around French strongpoints. Infantry followed, rifles ready, coordinating with the thunder of tanks. Every forest path became a corridor of destruction, every village a potential obstacle to be bypassed or neutralized. French officers scrambled to react. Artillery fired into advancing columns, shells tearing through earth and stone. Machine guns spat fire, infantry braced in trenches, but the speed of the German advance outpaced calculations. Communications struggled to keep up, orders arriving fragmented and late. Above, Luftwaffe fighters strafed retreating supply columns. Reconnaissance aircraft hovered, mapping French positions and relaying coordinates. Confusion rippled through defenders, as smoke, dust, and the roar of engines made identification of allies and enemies difficult. Every step forward was contested, every meter of land a battle in miniature. Roads became funnels of movement, forests traps of skirmish, and villages stages of improvisation and desperate resistance. Momentum was with the attackers. The line trembled under pressure. The first cracks appeared in the French defenses. Barrages of artillery could not stop the coordinated tank and infantry advance. Trenches that seemed impregnable were bypassed, positions encircled, and supply lines severed. Soldiers fought fiercely, but the velocity of the German attack overwhelmed carefully laid plans. Airstrikes tore through communication hubs. Telephone lines splintered. Telegraphs failed, and orders became delayed whispers in the chaos. Confusion spread like wildfire, leaving units isolated and disoriented. Rommel's spearheads pressed forward with relentless precision. Forests that had been assumed protective barriers now became avenues for breakthrough. Infantry clung to armored support, advancing with ruthless timing. Guderian's mechanized units bypassed villages and strongpoints, driving deep toward rivers and roads vital to French mobility. In towns and fields, civilians fled, carriages overturned, horses bolted, and towns emptied under the echo of engines and shells. Smoke and dust filled the sky, turning morning into a twilight of fire and movement. The French line was buckling. The tide had begun to turn. German flanking units struck with precision. Villages once thought safe became traps, roads clogged with retreating French troops, bridges contested and destroyed. Infantry and armor moved in tandem, cutting off avenues of escape, forcing defenders into hasty and chaotic retreats. French officers shouted orders over the roar of engines and artillery, trying to regroup isolated units. Soldiers scrambled, forming ad hoc lines, firing from cover, but every maneuver seemed anticipated. The speed and coordination of the German advance left little room for adjustment. Above, Luftwaffe bombers streaked past, hitting supply convoys and communication centers. Smoke spiraled into the sky, obscuring vision, adding terror to the battlefield. Reconnaissance planes relayed the rapid collapse of sectors, feeding the attackers' next moves. The front line wavered. Troops braced for counterattacks that never came in time. Each push of German armor, each leap forward, created chaos, confusion, and mounting fear. Momentum now dominated the battlefield. French reserves moved into position, hoping to stabilize the front. Infantry units hurried along muddy roads, artillery crews repositioned guns, and officers barked orders over the din. Yet German tanks and motorized infantry already held the advantage, striking faster than reinforcements could arrive. Artillery shells screamed through the sky, some finding their marks, others scattering harmlessly among dust and smoke. Machine guns fired in short bursts, cutting into advancing units, but gaps persisted, and flanking maneuvers exploited every opening. The Luftwaffe maintained air dominance, strafing retreating columns and supply lines. German pilots relayed enemy positions to ground commanders, refining the attack in real time. Mobility, coordination, and intelligence merged into a relentless push. Civilians fled along roads, their shadows merging with the chaos of soldiers and vehicles. Towns became temporary fortresses, then crumbling zones of resistance as the German advance tore through defenses. The French front teetered under pressure. Every second mattered, and hesitation could mean collapse. Key junctions fell in rapid succession. Bridges that anchored French lines were seized or destroyed, roads clogged with retreating units, and villages once defended with pride now surrendered under pressure. German panzers carved through the center, splitting forces and isolating pockets of resistance. French commanders scrambled, sending reserves into contested sectors, but coordination faltered. Orders arrived late or fragmented, and soldiers found themselves facing tanks, infantry, and air attacks simultaneously. Defensive lines became fragmented, each segment fighting for survival rather than cohesion. Above, the sky was alive with motion. Bombers rained fire on supply depots, while fighters strafed retreating columns. Smoke twisted and curled, obscuring the battlefield, while reconnaissance planes mapped each breach, enabling German units to exploit weaknesses with precision. Civilians fled en masse, clogging roads and bridges, unaware that the battle was becoming a storm they could not outrun. The front line was collapsing under speed, coordination, and unrelenting pressure. The German advance deepened. French positions began to crumble. Trenches emptied as artillery fire and tank advances made static defense untenable. Soldiers retreated under fire, attempting to regroup, but German armor moved faster than anticipated, cutting off escape routes and dividing forces. Panzers surged through villages, infantry following closely to secure streets and key structures. Smoke and dust created confusion, masking the attackers' movements while amplifying fear. Every captured road, every cleared village strengthened the German grip on momentum. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies. Dive bombers tore through communications and supply lines, while fighters strafed rear positions. French attempts to counterattack faltered under relentless pressure. Coordination collapsed, leaving soldiers to fight piecemeal against a machine that anticipated their every move. Civilians abandoned homes, fleeing with only what they could carry. Horses bolted, wagons overturned, and villages emptied in waves of chaos. The landscape itself seemed to bend to the invading force. Resistance faltered. Momentum dictated the battle's rhythm. German units closed in on isolated French strongpoints. Villages that had held for hours now fell under coordinated assault. Tanks rumbled through streets. Infantry swept behind, and artillery fire prevented organized resistance. Soldiers fought fiercely, but each defense was increasingly untenable. French officers attempted to consolidate remaining forces, but roads were jammed with retreating units and refugees. Communications broke down entirely in some sectors, leaving isolated pockets of troops to fend for themselves. Orders were shouted, ignored, or delayed, and the cohesion of the French front deteriorated rapidly. Above, the Luftwaffe's presence intensified. Bombers struck ammunition depots, while fighters strafed remaining columns. Smoke obscured vision, confusion reigned, and German forces exploited every breach. The combination of speed, coordination, and air dominance left the defenders scrambling with little chance to regroup. Civilians fled further west, roads crowded, villages abandoned, and the countryside echoed with the roar of engines and the tremor of artillery. Resistance was faltering, and the front line teetered on the edge of collapse. Momentum favored the attackers. French command struggled to regain control. Reports poured in from fragmented units. Towns lost, bridges captured, flanks exposed. Officers barked orders into broken lines of communication, but troops were already scattered, reacting rather than executing. German armored units pressed forward with unrelenting momentum. Panzer columns maneuvered around villages, bypassing resistance, while infantry secured captured roads and towns. Each advance compounded French disorganization, stretching defenses thinner and thinner. The Luftwaffe sustained pressure from above. Bombers hit key junctions and supply depots, fighters strafed retreating forces, and reconnaissance planes guided ground units to exploit new gaps. French anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and largely ineffective. Civilians moved en masse, clogging roads with wagons and vehicles, their fear palpable, mirroring the confusion of the defending armies. The landscape was a tableau of chaos, smoke, dust, and relentless movement. The French front was crumbling inch by inch as German forces dictated the pace and direction of the battle. French units launched desperate counterattacks. Infantry surged from trenches. Artillery shells rained down in support, and small groups attempted to reclaim lost villages. Soldiers fought with determination, their bravery evident, but momentum favored the Germans. Panzers pivoted to intercept counterattacks, armored columns striking flanks, while infantry closed in on exposed units. Coordination and speed rendered the French maneuvers fragmented and ineffective. Each push was met with a calculated German response, exploiting every opening with precision. Above, Luftwaffe fighters strafed retreating columns. Bombers targeted artillery positions, and reconnaissance planes relayed live positions to commanders. French attempts at coordination faltered under relentless air dominance. Civilians fled along crowded roads, villages emptied, smoke rising from contested towns. Panic mingled with courage, creating a human backdrop to the mechanical efficiency of the German advance. The French counterattacks faltered, the German momentum pressed forward, unbroken. German forces began encircling larger sectors. Entire French units found themselves cut off, retreat blocked by armor, flanked by infantry, and bombarded from above. Roads became deadly corridors, villages traps, and forests avenues for rapid German maneuver. French officers tried to regroup, sending reserves to threatened sectors, but coordination faltered. Messages arrived late, reinforcements collided with fleeing troops, and pockets of resistance became isolated, fighting alone against overwhelming mechanized power. The Luftwaffe reinforced the assault. Dive bombers targeted junctions and supply lines, fighters strafed rear units, and reconnaissance aircraft guided the armored advance. Air superiority magnified every breach, ensuring the Germans maintained initiative. Civilians fled further west, roads clogged with wagons, carts, and abandoned vehicles. Smoke and dust clouded vision, while the roar of engines and explosions dominated the soundscape. The front line disintegrated in isolated sectors. Momentum now dictated the shape of the battlefield. German units surged deeper, pressing toward French command centers and key infrastructure. Rail lines, bridges, and communication hubs were seized or destroyed, severing coordination and delaying counterorders. Each success widened gaps, leaving remaining forces exposed and disoriented. French officers struggled to maintain a coherent defense. Reserves were rerouted, often encountering retreating troops or impassable roads. Machine gun nests fired from isolated villages, but without artillery or armor support. Their efforts were piecemeal and quickly neutralized. Above, the Luftwaffe's dominance intensified. Bombers struck logistical targets, while fighters strafed retreating convoys, further paralyzing movement and command. Smoke and debris obscured the battlefield, confusing both soldiers and civilians. Civilians fled in increasing numbers, filling roads and fields with chaos. Horses bolted, carts overturned, and towns emptied in waves. The landscape itself seemed to bend to the relentless German advance. French command teetered on the brink of collapse. Remaining French defensive lines strained under the relentless German advance. Trenches were abandoned as artillery fire, and armored units forced withdrawals. Infantry clung to positions, firing into advancing tanks, but gaps widened with each passing minute. German units moved with precision, encircling strongpoints and cutting off retreat. Infantry cleared buildings while panzers rolled through streets, leaving French defenders isolated. Coordination and speed created an unstoppable rhythm, forcing defenders to react rather than act. The Luftwaffe continued to dominate the skies. Bombers struck command posts and supply depots, while fighters strafed retreating units. Communication breakdowns left French officers issuing orders into silence, their commands arriving too late or not at all. Civilians fled westward, roads jammed with wagons and carts, towns emptied in chaotic waves. The battlefield became a mosaic of smoke, dust, and movement, every step dictated by German momentum. The French line was unraveling, inch by inch. German forces exploited collapsing sectors to encircle large French formations. Roads clogged with retreating troops became kill zones, villages turned into fortified traps, and forests funneled soldiers directly into armored units. Coordination among defenders dissolved as panic spread. French officers attempted last-minute countermeasures. Reserves were rushed to threaten sectors, but they collided with fleeing units or encountered impassable obstacles. Artillery fire fell sporadically. Infantry fought in isolation, and attempts to stabilize the front failed. Above, the Luftwaffe maintained ruthless pressure. Bombers struck communication centers and supply lines, while fighters strafed retreating troops. Smoke, fire, and dust obscured vision, heightening confusion and fear across the battlefield. Civilians fled en masse, leaving towns and villages empty, roads choked with carts and carriages. The air vibrated with engines, explosions, and the human response to chaos. The German advance tightened its grip. Momentum now ruled the battlefield. French defenses collapsed in critical sectors, opening the way to strategic objectives. Critical French sectors collapsed under the relentless German push. Trenches emptied, artillery positions overrun, and infantry retreated in disarray. Panzers rolled through roads once thought safe, cutting supply lines and isolating units. French command struggled to respond. Orders arrived late, scattered or not at all. Officers attempted to reorganize fragmented units, but the velocity and coordination of the German advance left little room for recovery. Luftwaffe bombers and fighters intensified the assault. Supply depots and junctions were destroyed, rear positions strafed, and reconnaissance planes guided armored units to exploit emerging gaps. French troops faced overwhelming pressure from ground and air simultaneously. Civilians fled westward in panic. Villages emptied, carts overturned, and roads jammed with the fleeing, creating a chaotic landscape. Smoke and dust from artillery and engines mingled, turning the battlefield into a haze of chaos. The French line was unraveling rapidly. German forces dictated every movement. Remaining pockets of resistance attempt desperate retreats under encirclement. Remaining pockets of French resistance attempted desperate retreats. Infantry withdrew from villages, artillery crews abandoned guns, and officers tried to rally scattered soldiers. But German armor and infantry blocked main routes, encircling units before they could regroup. Panzers maneuvered to intercept escape paths, while infantry secured strategic crossroads. Every retreating unit faced ambushes, roadblocks, and fire from multiple directions. Coordination among defenders dissolved completely. The Luftwaffe's dominance ensured no relief could arrive. Bombers demolished bridges and depots, while fighters strafed convoys, turning roads into gauntlets. Smoke and debris obscured sightlines, disorienting soldiers and civilians alike. Civilians fled in waves, converging on fewer passable roads, creating chaos that slowed movements and amplified panic. Towns emptied under the relentless advance, the countryside echoing with engines, gunfire, and human fear. The French forces were increasingly isolated, their retreat becoming a desperate struggle for survival. German forces pressed forward, tightening encirclements and sealing the fate of French units. German forces pressed forward relentlessly, tightening encirclements around French units. Villages, roads, and crossroads became cages, leaving defenders trapped and disoriented. Tanks and infantry coordinated to close escape routes, leaving few options for retreat or reinforcement. French commanders frantically attempted to regroup. Units moved in piecemeal, communication faltered, and isolated soldiers tried to hold positions without support. Artillery fired sporadically, but coordination was impossible under constant pressure. Above, the Luftwaffe struck with devastating precision. Bombers demolished remaining supply depots, while fighters strafed retreating troops. Smoke, dust, and fire created chaos, masking German movements and magnifying confusion among defenders. Civilians fled west, roads choked with carts, wagons, and panicked families. Towns emptied, fields filled with movement, and the countryside became a theater of speed, fire, and terror. The front line was collapsing. German forces dictated the tempo of every engagement. Key French positions fall completely, opening the way for the next phase of the Blitzkrieg. Key French positions fell completely. Villages that had resisted for hours surrendered or were overrun. Bridges, crossroads, and rail lines were captured, severing French coordination and isolating remaining units. The momentum of the German advance became unstoppable. French officers attempted emergency redeployments. Artillery fired in bursts, infantry tried to hold streets, but the coordination necessary for a meaningful counterattack no longer existed. Troops scattered, some surrendering, others attempting to flee through congested and dangerous routes. The Luftwaffe maintained absolute control of the skies. Bombers demolished supply depots and command posts. Fighters strafed retreating convoys. Smoke and dust obscured sightlines, turning towns and fields into chaotic labyrinths of fire and movement. Civilians fled westward. Roads jammed, carts overturned, and horses bolted. The battlefield had become a torrent of human and mechanical motion, dictated entirely by the speed and coordination of the German advance. French defenses teetered on the edge of complete collapse. German forces encircle remaining pockets, forcing capitulation or annihilation. German forces encircled the remaining French pockets. Isolated units found escape routes blocked by tanks, infantry, and artillery. Villages became cages, forests traps, and roads deadly gauntlets. The defenders' cohesion had disintegrated, leaving them at the mercy of coordinated mechanized forces. French officers issued desperate orders, rallying scattered troops, but the tempo of the German advance outpaced any hope of organized resistance. Artillery fired sporadically, infantry clung to cover, but each position was systematically neutralized. The Luftwaffe dominated above. Bombers destroyed communication lines and depots, while fighters strafed retreating convoys. Smoke, fire, and dust obscured vision, disorienting both soldiers and civilians, magnifying confusion and fear. Civilians fled west, roads clogged with carts and wagons, towns emptied in waves, and the countryside became a theater of chaos, motion, and human panic. The French front had fractured entirely. German forces dictated every movement, every choice, every fate. The German advance secures decisive control, setting the stage for the turning point. By May 16th, the German advance had reached a critical juncture. Entire French formations were disoriented, retreating along clogged roads, while tanks and motorized infantry cut off escape routes. The battlefield was a blur of motion, fire, and chaos. Yet in the midst of triumph, cracks appeared. Overextended units faced supply shortages. Fuel and ammunition became scarce. Communication lines strained under constant movement, leaving some divisions isolated. Commanders realized that speed, while decisive, required careful management. In Paris, the French High Command debated responses. Reinforcements were unavailable, and remaining reserves risked destruction if committed recklessly. Strategic decisions now hinged on timing, terrain, and intelligence that was imperfect at best. Rommel's spearheads pressed forward relentlessly, exploiting gaps with precision. Guderian's mechanized columns struck at rail lines, further fragmenting French mobility. Yet even the most coordinated advance faced the subtle friction of logistics, terrain, and fatigue. As the first tremors of overextension appeared, the momentum of Blitzkrieg met the limits of planning and endurance. The war's direction teetered. A decisive maneuver will determine the fate of the French army. On the northern front, French commanders identified a fleeting opportunity. A German armored column had pushed beyond its supply line, engines overheating, fuel dwindling. Infantry units were strung out, vulnerable to coordinated counterpressure. French officers acted swiftly, redirecting remaining reserves to threatened sectors. Artillery fire concentrated on exposed panzers, while infantry positioned to block retreat routes. "We must strike now," one officer urged, the urgency clear in his voice. Rommel and Guderian, confident in momentum, underestimated the resilience of isolated defenders. Reconnaissance missed subtle signs, roads clogged, fuel depots depleted, communications disrupted. Speed alone could not carry them indefinitely. Across the battlefield, scattered skirmishes intensified. Smoke from burning villages mingled with artillery dust, creating a murky horizon. The German advance, once unstoppable, began to face friction, slowing, testing coordination. For the first time, the French realized that rapid mechanized forces were not invincible. A decisive maneuver could reshape the battlefield. French counterattacks and strategic choices set the stage for pivotal moments. French forces executed coordinated strikes against overextended German units. Artillery thundered, targeting supply columns and isolated panzers. Infantry blocked retreat routes, forcing armored vehicles to slow or reroute. Smoke and debris from burning equipment clouded vision, creating confusion among the attackers. Guderian's divisions struggled to maintain momentum. Communication delays, clogged roads, and unexpected resistance fragmented the advance. Rommel's spearheads pressed forward, but found supply shortages limiting operational reach. Amid the chaos, local French commanders seized initiative. Rapid decisions exploited German vulnerabilities, forcing tactical withdrawals and temporary halts. Even the fastest advance can falter under pressure, a historian later noted, capturing the tension of these critical hours. Civilians watched from the edges of towns, sensing subtle shifts in the tide. Roads still clogged with refugees, villages scarred, but a glimmer of resistance emerged. The battle's dynamic had shifted. Speed was no longer an absolute advantage. Momentum could be challenged. Strategic decisions now determined the fate of both armies. The French High Command acted decisively. Reserves were funneled to threatened sectors, creating improvised defensive lines and blocking critical roads. Artillery targeted gaps, infantry fortified villages, and engineers destroyed bridges to slow the German advance. Rommel and Guderian recognized the danger. Orders were issued to consolidate gains, but hesitation cost precious hours. Supply shortages and exhausted units slowed mechanized columns. The Blitzkrieg rhythm faced its first true test. French soldiers, once scattered, now fought in coordinated bursts. Small towns became fortresses and ambushes disrupted German timing. Every hit slowed the advance, forcing armored units to adjust and regroup under fire. Above, the Luftwaffe continued to dominate, yet even air support could not fully compensate for stretched supply lines and localized resistance. The battlefield became a chessboard of rapid maneuvers, testing commanders' foresight and adaptability. The tide was no longer unidirectional. The German advance could be checked, even if only temporarily. The consequences of these maneuvers begin to reshape the strategic situation. By mid-May, the German advance had slowed in critical sectors. Roads clogged with refugees and damaged vehicles hampered speed. Exhausted crews and depleted fuel forced temporary halts. Mechanized units could no longer exploit gaps as freely as before. French commanders capitalized on this pause. Artillery bombardments targeted overstretched columns, while infantry staged ambushes on exposed flanks. Defensive positions, though improvised, slowed momentum and inflicted measurable disruption. Rommel and Guderian, aware of the emerging resistance, adjusted strategies. Orders to consolidate, resupply, and regroup rippled through command channels. Even the fastest panzers were limited by logistics and terrain, and tactical miscalculations could no longer be masked by sheer speed. The battlefield transformed from a headlong surge into a series of calculated engagements. Local successes by French units demonstrated that coordination and timing could momentarily neutralize mechanized superiority. For the first time, the inevitability of German victory was in doubt. Strategic balance hung by a thread. German forces respond to French countermeasures, seeking to regain lost momentum. German commanders responded swiftly. Units were rerouted, flanks reinforced, and supply lines prioritized. Panzers pressed on cautiously, while infantry cleared villages and secured roads. Timing and coordination became paramount as momentum slowed under resistance. French forces exploited every delay. Artillery strikes targeted bridges and choke points. Infantry staged ambushes and engineers sabotaged roads. Every disruption forced German columns to adjust, slowing progress and creating tactical opportunities. Rommel, surveying the front, recognized the limits of speed without support. Guderian recalculated routes, balancing aggression with caution. Even Blitzkrieg's signature velocity required careful management when stretched across contested terrain. Above, the Luftwaffe provided cover, but extended supply lines and localized counterattacks tested the limits of air superiority. Every sortie had to be weighed against fuel, ammunition, and timing constraints. For the first time, the German juggernaut faced friction from both terrain and resistance. The turning point of the campaign had arrived. Decisions made now will shape the outcome of the battle. French commanders seized the initiative. Remaining reserves were repositioned to threaten sectors, creating pockets of concentrated resistance. Artillery fire targeted overextended panzer columns, while infantry ambushed exposed flanks. Local coordination amplified the effect of each strike. Rommel and Guderian adapted quickly, but hesitation and fragmented units slowed the advance. Reconnaissance reported bottlenecks and fuel shortages, forcing tactical recalibration. Speed alone could no longer dictate outcomes. Precision and timing became critical. Civilians observing from village edges felt the subtle shift. Smoke and dust still filled the horizon, but German units moved with a caution previously unseen. The battlefield, once dominated by unstoppable momentum, now demanded calculation and patience. The clash of tactics intensified. French countermeasures disrupted movement, slowed mechanized advances, and challenged command assumptions. Even the most disciplined units encountered resistance that could not be bypassed without consequence. The battle hung in delicate balance. Small decisions now carried outsized consequences. The first measurable halts in the German advance reshaped strategic calculations. For the first time, German columns experienced measurable halts. Fuel shortages, blocked roads, and concentrated French resistance forced units to pause, regroup, and reassess. Momentum wavered and the perception of invincibility began to fade. French commanders exploited these pauses relentlessly. Infantry units staged precise ambushes, artillery struck exposed columns, and engineers sabotaged roads and bridges. Each disruption magnified delays and forced German units to disperse attention across multiple threats. Rommel and Guderian coordinated with headquarters to consolidate gains, but the tempo of Blitzkrieg had been disrupted. Even the Luftwaffe, dominant in the skies, could not compensate for overstretched ground units. Reconnaissance flights revealed clogged roads, scattered units, and frustrated armored columns. Civilians still fleeing westward observed smoke rising in unexpected areas, sensing the subtle shift in fortune. The battlefield, though chaotic, now displayed moments of balance. The German advance was no longer unchallenged. The turning point of the campaign was underway. Tactical decisions and leadership choices will determine the immediate outcome. French commanders made critical decisions. Reserves were concentrated at vulnerable points, villages fortified, and ambushes laid along overextended supply routes. Small units struck with precision, slowing armored columns and creating pockets of confusion. German officers recognized the threat. Rommel rerouted units, Guderian shifted armored divisions, and coordination became increasingly complex. Yet stretched lines and exhausted crews limited recovery, forcing measured advances instead of the relentless Blitzkrieg tempo. The Luftwaffe remained a powerful ally, but even air support could not undo delays caused by terrain, resistance, and logistical friction. Bombing runs had to be carefully timed. Miscalculations risked hitting friendly forces or missing critical targets. Civilians still fled, but the landscape of chaos now included moments of French tactical success. Smoke, dust, and fire obscured vision, but pockets of resistance disrupted the German timetable. The battlefield's rhythm had changed. Momentum alone would no longer dictate outcomes. German forces struggled to regain initiative, while French resistance consolidates. German forces struggled to regain initiative. Panzer columns paused to refuel and regroup. Infantry consolidated positions, and commanders attempted to restore cohesion across fragmented units. The previously unstoppable surge now met resistance at multiple points. French defenders consolidated their gains. Artillery fired on exposed armored units, ambushes slowed infantry, and engineers destroyed roads and bridges to limit mobility. Small coordinated actions magnified the impact, delaying advances and forcing adjustments across the front. Rommel and Guderian reassessed the battlefield. Supply shortages, road congestion, and mounting fatigue required careful management. Even Blitzkrieg, designed for speed and surprise, faced the hard limits of extended operations. The Luftwaffe continued to dominate the skies, but isolated resistance, smoke and debris reduced the efficiency of bombing runs. Every sortie required precision and timing, adding pressure to already stretched units. For the first time, German forces faced operational friction that could not be ignored. The tide of battle had shifted. Strategic outcomes of this turning point will soon reveal themselves. The consequences of the turning point began to reveal themselves. German units, once advancing with unstoppable momentum, now moved cautiously. Bottlenecks, supply issues, and concentrated French resistance forced slower, more deliberate operations. French commanders seized the opportunity. Infantry held key villages, artillery pounded overextended columns, and ambushes disrupted armored movements. Even limited resources now had outsized effects, creating temporary but significant halts in the advance. Rommel and Guderian recalculated. Orders emphasized consolidation, protection of flanks and careful coordination with supporting units. The speed and aggression that defined the initial assault were tempered by necessity. Above, the Luftwaffe remained a formidable presence, yet extended operations and concentrated resistance limited its ability to dominate. Reconnaissance highlighted obstacles and fuel shortages, reinforcing the importance of precise planning. The battlefield had shifted from one of pure momentum to one of strategic calculation. Every decision now carried amplified consequences. The stage is set for the German advance to resume under new constraints, while French forces exploit temporary advantages. The German advance resumed, but under constraints shaped by the turning point. Panzers moved methodically, infantry cleared villages cautiously, and commanders prioritized cohesion over speed. Momentum no longer guaranteed success. French forces exploited these openings. Ambushes along roads slowed armored columns, artillery struck weak points, and infantry occupied strategic high ground. Even small units forced operational recalculations, highlighting the value of coordinated resistance. Rommel and Guderian adapted quickly. Units were rerouted, reserves shifted to reinforce threatened sectors, and engineers repaired key bridges to restore mobility. Speed remained an advantage, but precision now dictated results. The Luftwaffe maintained support, striking depots and concentrations of troops, yet even air superiority could not offset tactical friction on the ground. Smoke, fire and debris further complicated operations, creating moments where momentum faltered. For the first time, German forces confronted the limits of Blitzkrieg. Strategic awareness and resource management became as crucial as speed and surprise. The final phase of the turning point will determine the immediate outcome of the battle. The final phase of the turning point unfolded. French commanders consolidated forces along critical corridors, creating choke points and defensive nodes. Infantry, artillery, and engineers coordinated to maximize disruption against advancing German columns. German units adjusted tactics. Tanks proceeded with caution. Infantry secured flanks and commanders calculated the risks of overextension. Supply lines and fuel became strategic concerns, slowing operations despite aggressive intent. Local skirmishes became decisive. Small units, leveraging terrain and timing, delayed panzer movements and disrupted communication between armored and infantry formations. Each delay amplified friction across the front. The Luftwaffe maintained pressure, targeting concentrations of resistance, yet smoke and debris from ambushes obscured vision, limiting effectiveness. Commanders relied increasingly on reconnaissance and coordination, not just raw speed. The battlefield now demanded strategy over momentum. Both sides faced choices that would shape the immediate outcome as the turning point crystallized the limits of speed and the power of coordinated resistance. Consequences of this turning point begin to ripple across the campaign. Consequences of the turning point rippled across the campaign. German columns, once unopposed, now faced delays, disrupted supply lines, and stretched communication networks. Tactical friction slowed advances, forcing a recalibration of priorities. French commanders pressed the advantage. Isolated victories, though small, bought critical time. Artillery barrages, infantry ambushes, and sabotage of roads and bridges amplified operational friction, forcing German units to proceed with caution. Rommel and Guderian adapted quickly, but even experienced commanders could not entirely negate the effects of overextension. Consolidation, resupply, and reorganization became essential to maintain momentum. The Luftwaffe continued to support ground operations, but extended missions and obscured targets reduced efficiency. Every sortie required precision and careful timing, amplifying the importance of coordination. The battlefield, once defined by speed and surprise, now balanced on calculation, timing, and resource management. The turning point was complete momentum challenged, strategy dominant. The campaign enters a new phase, setting the stage for aftermath and consequences. Aftermath and consequences. The fall of France was swift yet strategically layered. Within weeks, German forces had penetrated deep into French territory, capturing key cities, bridges, and transport hubs. The French army, though courageous, faced staggering disruption in command, communication, and logistics. Territorial control shifted rapidly. German units occupied northern and central regions, while French forces retreated toward the south, seeking defensible positions and reorganization. Urban centers, once bustling with civilian life, were scarred by battle and abandoned in haste. Casualties were significant yet difficult to tally precisely. Soldiers and civilians suffered alike, displaced and exhausted. Equipment losses included tanks, artillery, and vehicles, most abandoned under pressure or destroyed to prevent capture. Morale shifted sharply. German confidence surged with rapid advances, while French forces grappled with disarray and the challenge of regrouping. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield, influencing political, civilian, and military spheres alike. The war's strategic balance tilted. The capture of France opened Western Europe to German influence and reshaped Allied planning, forcing rapid reconsideration of defense, supply, and coalition coordination. The broader human and operational consequences of the Blitzkrieg are revealed. The human cost was profound. Thousands of soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured, while millions of civilians were displaced, fleeing advancing forces or seeking shelter from bombardments. Entire communities were uprooted, leaving towns and villages empty and silent. Equipment losses were staggering. Tanks, artillery, and vehicles abandoned in retreat were captured or destroyed. Rail lines and bridges, vital for movement and supply, were damaged or rendered unusable. Both sides faced the challenge of replenishing resources, but Germany emerged with captured material bolstering its campaign. Morale across France was fractured. Soldiers grappled with the speed and efficiency of the German advance, while civilian populations adjusted to occupation, rationing, and uncertainty. Conversely, German forces experienced heightened confidence, their doctrines validated and momentum reinforced. Strategically, the fall of France reshaped the European theatre. Germany gained access to ports, airfields, and industrial centres, while Allied forces in Britain reconsidered defence strategies. Commanders on both sides learned the power of speed, coordination, and the critical importance of logistics. The consequences of this campaign resonated beyond immediate territorial gains, altering the political, military, and social landscape of Western Europe. The long-term effects and lessons of the campaign emerge. Long-term, the fall of France reshaped military planning across Europe. The speed of the German advance emphasized the necessity of mobile warfare, combined arms tactics, and rapid communication. Static defenses alone had proven insufficient. Territorial occupation allowed Germany to consolidate control over strategic regions, including industrial centers, ports, and transportation networks. Allied supply lines faced greater pressure, requiring new strategies for reinforcement and coordination from Britain and beyond. Morale and perception shifted dramatically. The success of Blitzkrieg fueled confidence in German military doctrines, while Allied nations confronted the reality of a rapidly changing battlefield. The psychological impact influenced recruitment, propaganda, and diplomatic negotiations for months to come. Humanitarian consequences lingered. Displaced civilians faced uncertainty, overcrowding, and shortages. Soldiers captured in large numbers joined the growing ranks of prisoners of war. while communities struggled to rebuild amid destruction and disruption. The campaign left lessons etched in strategy and doctrine. Speed, coordination, and adaptability defined modern warfare, while overextension and logistical oversight could temper even the most formidable advance. Strategic insights prepare the stage for reflection and analysis in the next section. Reflection and analysis. The fall of France in 1940 offers a masterclass in operational art and the limits of doctrine. Blitzkrieg's success underscored the value of speed, surprise, and mechanized coordination, yet it also revealed vulnerabilities in supply, communication, and overextension. French defenses, though formidable on paper, were undermined by rigidity and a reliance on static fortifications. The Maginot Line, symbol of national security, proved ineffective when the enemy bypassed it entirely, demonstrating that defensive doctrine must anticipate maneuver and adaptability. Command decisions became decisive factors. German commanders such as Guderian and Rommel exhibited flexibility, exploiting intelligence, terrain, and timing to maximize impact. French officers, conversely, were often reactive, struggling to adapt to a rapidly evolving battlefield. Logistics emerged as the unseen determinant. Fuel shortages, clogged roads, and communication delays constrained even the fastest units, proving that operational reach is limited by material sustainment. Speed without support is a double-edged sword. The human dimension cannot be overlooked. Morale, discipline, and initiative shaped engagements, with smaller units occasionally altering outcomes despite overwhelming mechanized superiority. Leadership lessons, tactical insights, and strategic reflections deepen. Leadership emerged as a central theme. German commanders combined audacity with calculated risk-taking, synchronizing armored, infantry, and air units with remarkable efficiency. Decisions were decentralized when necessary, empowering lower-ranking officers to exploit fleeting opportunities. French leadership, constrained by rigid hierarchy, struggled to adapt. Communication delays and fragmented information slowed responses, allowing mechanized advances to outpace defensive measures. Even courageous counterattacks often arrived too late or were poorly coordinated. Tactical innovation was decisive. The German use of combined arms tanks, supported by infantry and close air support, created operational synergy, overwhelming isolated French units. Meanwhile, the French emphasis on fortifications and linear defense failed to counter mobile, multidimensional attacks. Logistical foresight proved critical. Mechanized forces demanded constant resupply of fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. Overextension risked operational paralysis, as units far from depots became vulnerable. Speed alone could not substitute for planning. The campaign demonstrated that strategy, flexibility, and adaptation often outweigh numerical superiority. Technology, doctrine, and morale intersected, shaping outcomes that static analysis alone could not predict. Lessons for modern strategy and historical interpretation are explored. The fall of France illustrates the enduring importance of adaptability in warfare. Doctrine must evolve to match technological and operational realities. The German combination of tanks, motorized infantry, and air support demonstrated the decisive potential of integrated forces when applied dynamically. French rigidity offers cautionary insight. Dependence on static defenses and predictable movements allowed the enemy to dictate the tempo. Even numerical superiority cannot compensate for inflexibility or delayed decision-making in high-velocity operations. Terrain and intelligence proved pivotal. Germans exploited gaps, bypassed strongpoints, and targeted weakly defended corridors. Accurate reconnaissance enabled rapid exploitation, while French units were hampered by poor situational awareness and disrupted communication lines. Morale and initiative were equally vital. Units that maintained cohesion and executed local countermeasures could delay or disrupt superior forces. Leadership that empowered initiative, even at lower levels, produced disproportionate effects on operational outcomes. This campaign offers enduring lessons. Technological advantage must be coupled with strategic foresight, flexibility, and robust logistics. Victory favors those who harmonize speed, coordination, and adaptability. The interplay of planning, logistics, and operational art is further examined. Planning and preparation were decisive yet insufficient without adaptability. German forces meticulously coordinated movements, supply, and air support, yet relied on the ability to respond quickly to unexpected obstacles. Their success was not only in planning, but in the capacity to adjust mid-campaign. French forces, despite careful fortification and numerical strength, lacked operational elasticity. Orders took time to propagate, and rigid hierarchy prevented lower-level commanders from exploiting fleeting opportunities. Even when local initiative was shown, systemic delays limited strategic impact. Logistics revealed its central role. Mechanized warfare demanded constant fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. German advances risked stalling if supply chains failed, illustrating that operational brilliance is inseparable from material sustainment. Coordination across combined arms magnified combat effectiveness. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and air forces, when synchronized, produced effects far greater than the sum of their parts. Conversely, disjointed efforts, no matter how determined, often fell short. The fall of France demonstrates a timeless principle. Success in war is determined by the integration of planning, flexibility, logistics, and human initiative. Broader strategic insights and historical lessons deepen. Historical insight emphasizes that momentum can be decisive, yet fragile. Blitzkrieg relied on speed and surprise, but the turning point showed that overextension exposes vulnerabilities. Operational tempo must be balanced against logistical capacity and situational awareness. French countermeasures highlighted the value of initiative at all levels. Even temporary halts and localized resistance forced recalibration, demonstrating that adaptive tactics can disrupt superior forces when leveraged intelligently. The campaign also underscores the importance of intelligence. Reconnaissance failures, delayed reporting, and misjudged terrain can compound into strategic disadvantage. Conversely, accurate information allows rapid exploitation of fleeting opportunities. Technological advantage, though vital, is insufficient without doctrine and training. Mechanized forces, superior tanks, and air support created potential, but only coordinated execution translated technology into battlefield success. Ultimately, the fall of France reinforces enduring lessons. Flexibility, coordination, logistics, and decisive leadership shape outcomes as much as raw numbers or firepower. History rewards those who anticipate, adapt, and act decisively. Concluding reflections tie tactical lessons to strategic implications. Concluding reflections highlight the interplay between strategy and execution. German success demonstrated how concentrated force, rapid maneuver, and coordination can overwhelm even numerically equal opponents. Strategy alone is insufficient without disciplined, synchronized execution. French experience offers cautionary lessons. Dependence on rigid plans, static fortifications, and hierarchical decision-making slowed responses and reduced operational effectiveness. Even courageous counterattacks were constrained by structural inflexibility. Logistics and sustainment remain central. Fuel, ammunition, and maintenance dictated the feasible tempo of operations. German forces, despite initial dominance, risked operational pause due to overextended supply lines, proving that momentum is inseparable from material support. Leadership at all levels shaped outcomes. Decentralized initiative, rapid decision-making, and adaptive command proved decisive for the Germans, while limited flexibility hindered French responses. History underscores that human judgment and initiative can turn marginal advantages into strategic victories. The campaign illustrates timeless principles. Integration of technology, planning, logistics, and leadership defines operational success, while over-reliance on rigidity invites defeat. The stage is set for next section, epic closing, reflecting on the campaign's enduring significance. Epic closing. Imagine standing on a silent battlefield, where weeks ago the roar of tanks, the thunder of artillery, and the scream of engines filled the air. Towns lie empty, roads choked with abandoned vehicles, and smoke drifts lazily over scarred fields. The speed, precision, and chaos of the Blitzkrieg are now memory, etched into every scar of the landscape. The fall of France reshaped Europe in ways both immediate and enduring. Cities fell, armies surrendered or fled, and civilians faced displacement, fear, and uncertainty. Yet within that devastation, lessons emerged on strategy, leadership, and the imperatives of adaptability. Commanders on both sides were tested. Rommel and Guderian demonstrated audacity and coordination, while French officers confronted the limits of rigid planning and the cost of delayed decision-making. Logistical mastery and human initiative proved as decisive as weaponry. As the dust settles, the echoes of the campaign linger. Momentum, surprise, and speed dictated the first hours, but strategy, foresight, and flexibility determined the outcome. History is not only written by victories, but by the lessons extracted from them. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most dramatic campaigns of the Second World War. Your curiosity keeps history alive. Next time, How Logistics Win Wars. WW2. Example: you won't believe what happened there.